Hello everybody, and I'm here to give you guys a recap for the Silverblood Promise by James Logan. So on the 6th of November, the sequel to this lovely book is coming out. This was my favorite read of 2024, so I have just come back from enjoying a reread of it, and I'm here to give you a recap for it so that if you don't have the time to reread this novel before going into the Blackfire Blades, you won't be missing out on anything. And at the end I'll also give some of my thoughts about what is to come, what has been going on, and I'll leave a timestamp for those of you who don't need to recap in order to get to that section of the video. So we start off our journey with our protagonist Lucan Gardova, who is just returning from a night of gambling. So he is, it seems to be living loose, drinking, gambling, just passing time. And as he is leaving his most recent haunt, he gets the feeling that he is being pursued. So he tries to shake off his pursuers. He goes into this sort of like side alley to try and shake them off. However, he stumbles upon more dark characters when he steps into that alleyway, and so he has to try and fight his way out of it. While he's trying to fight his way out of this situation, he is assisted by a former acquaintance of him, because he is assisted by his former teacher, Shafia, who has actually been trying to locate him to share news of his father's passing with him. Now, Lucan and his father have had a bit of a falling out. They had been falling out gradually since the passing of his mother. However, the falling out had definitely increased when Lucan was expelled from the academy, and so Lucan then basically just ran away and pursued his life elsewhere. Nonetheless, he feels a great amount of grief when he learns about his father's passing, and his father has actually left him a message, because written in his own blood he has left a note with 3 words on it: Lucan, Safrona and Zandrusa. These 3 words will set Lucan off on an adventure, because Lucan is of course a message to his son, Safrona is the name of a city, and Zandrusa, he is unaware of what it means, and Shafia also doesn't know what or who Zandrusa might be. Lucan then swears a Silverblood promise that he will get to the bottom of this, that he will travel to Safrona and find out who is behind the killing of his father. When he first catches sight of Safrona, the first thing that really calls his attention is this big black tower that is standing there, which is called the Ebon Gate. The Ebon Gate is a Fyron relic. Basically, the Fyron are this ancient civilization that have gone missing, that have been destroyed at some point, and they were a great interest to Lucan's father. Now, this Ebon Hand, this building, has been turned into a high security prison by the Inquisition of Safrona, and from the captain of the ship he is boarded, Lucan finds out that in 5 days' time there will be a big celebration on Safrona, a big celebration to celebrate the reunification of Saragossa and Safrona, a celebration called the Grand Restoration. In the past, Saragossa and Safrona were often in battle with one another, and a third enemy, the Corsair of the Shattered Islands, tried to take advantage of their weakness and attack both of them in their weakened state. However, at that point in time in history, they decided to band together and defeat the Corsair of the Shattered Islands together, and every year they celebrate this restoration by having this ceremony in which the spear of the Corsair is handed over between the 2 powers. At that point in time, we also find out a little bit about the political power within Safrona, because officially power rests with a duke. However, the real power within the city rests with the high merchants. Basically, there are these 7 merchant princes who own these big towers that he can spot from the sea, and they hold the biggest economical power, and therefore they also hold the biggest political power. And these 7 princes are referred to as the Silken Septets. Now, Lucan has to kind of settle the score with the capital before he's allowed to leave the ship, because he's basically been plundering liquor stores while he's been aboard the ship. And so the captain offers him the choice: either settle the score financially or he will be dropped off in the sea, which is infested by lion sharks. So of course Logan decides to just pay his way through. Upon arrival in the city, he immediately spots one of the most famous sights in Safrona, which is the city gate that is made up of the skeleton of an enormous creature. He passes through and makes his way to the marketplace, where he starts making inquiries about Sandrusa, trying to find anybody who knows who or what this term might refer to. No one seems to have a clue as to who Sandrusa might be. However, when he's taking a break, he catches a thief trying to steal his rucksack, a young girl called Flea. Flea has previously lost a finger because she has been caught stealing before. However, Lucan decides not to turn her in to the authorities. He tells her of his conundrum, and she negotiates with him in order to lead him to a blind wise man who might be able to help him out with his inquiry. Flea then leads him to Obasa, but Obasa is indeed a wise man because he refuses to tell Lucan anything if he doesn't come clean, telling him his real name and his real story, which Lucan eventually does after some guarantees that Obasa is not part of the Kindred, the local mafia gangs. That way he finds out that Sandrusa is actually the name of a former smuggler who came over from Zaragoza to Safrona. When she acquired enough funds, she did go legit and became a real merchant and actually made it into the Gilded Council. However, she has changed her name, which is why a lot of people didn't know about the name Sandrusa, so now she is going by the name Saida Jelassi. And unfortunately for Lucan, her execution is actually scheduled for the next day because she stands accused of having killed a fellow merchant called Lord Saviola. She was found crouched over his body with a dagger in her hand. Lucan attends Sandrusa's execution the next day. Basically, the execution takes place in an arena called the Bone Pit. 3 prisoners are led into the arena, and their collaboration is kind of controlled by 2 gleamers. Gleamers are basically the magical users of this world. They are always a duo. One calls the power into this world and the other one gives shape to it. From the pits, a monster emerges, and the monster will kill one of the 3 prisoners. Luckily for Lucan, he decides to kill one of the other prisoners, and so Sandrusa walks free, only to have to return to the Bone Pit in a few days' time to go through the ritual all over again. Lucan therefore knows that he now has to find a way into the Ebon Hand to try and talk to her before she is properly executed. Lucan returns to Abasa, who tells him that he should seek out the help of the Scrivener, who is a famous forger and part of the criminal underworld. Lucan therefore goes to this particular bar that he is told to go to and orders a drink with a poisonous flower in it, which is the signal to the bar that he is looking for contact with the Scrivener. He is then approached by a man who asks him why he wants to meet with the Scrivener, and who tells them that if he wants to meet with the Scrivener, he will have to go through a test. And the test is a sort of game of chance in which he, along with 3 other participants, will be playing a game that features a Pharaon relic. The relic is pyramid shaped and has all of these buttons for them to touch. The contestants start from the lowest rung of the pyramid and make their way up. In every single row there is one button that will cause severe pain and hallucinations, and the higher up you go along the pyramid, the less likely you are of getting a safe button when it's your turn. Lucan plays a game with some fellow contestants, including a lady referred to as the Lady in Red and a guy who he is very much trying to aggravate. He makes it successfully through a first round without having to suffer any hallucinations and any illusions. However, during the second round, the button that he pushes actually creates a illusion of a centipede bursting through his flesh. After mentally recovering, he manages to antagonize his fellow contestants to such an extent that he tries to attack Lucan, which leads to his disqualification. However, Lucan very soon afterwards presses another wrong button and has another hallucination which leaves him unconscious and therefore disqualified from the game. Lucan awakens and is drugged in order to present him to the Scrivener, because apparently he didn't really actually have to win the game in order to meet the Scrivener. It was enough that he showed a willingness to participate. He is led before the Scrivener, who proposes that he tries to make his way into the Ebon Hand disguised as an Inquisitor. She expresses an interest for him to ask certain questions of Lady Jelassi, and mainly what she wants to know is more details surrounding the murder of Lord Saviola, because she wants to kind of figure out what actually happened there. She also offers Lucan a clay jar that he has to give to Lady Jelassi when he sees her, with the instructions that they might help her when she next has to face the monster in the bone pits. Lucan disguises himself as an Inquisitor and commandeers a small boat in order to go over to the Ebon Hand, where he manages to step inside but is questioned by one of the guards over there who has never seen him before. He tries to avoid having to call upon the captain, as he is pretty sure that that will lead to him being found out. However, the captain just happens to step by. He inspects Lucan's paper and seems to accept them offhand and escorts him on his way to Lady Jelassi's jail cell. When speaking to Jelassi, she reveals that she did know his father and that she suspects that his father sent him her way because she actually has a pharaoh chest in her possession that will only open up to Lucan. However, Lucan does not have access to this particular chest because it is being stored within the Bank of Safrona, and of course, as she is currently in a jail cell, she does not have access to the vault, and neither will they be opening up the vault for anybody else at this point in time. So it remains for him to prove her innocence in order for him to be able to get access to this chest. Jelassi on her end suspects a fellow merchant called Murillo of being the one behind the assassination, because she and Lord Saviola were working on a new sort of bill that would grant greater opportunity to the lower classes, and Murillo was a merchant who stood most to lose from that bill coming true and who also was opposing it the most. She doesn't really have much to offer in terms of evidence against him. However, the one thing that she remembers about the situation that did really caught her attention was the fact that there was frost on the body. So she urges Lucan to check with the physician who investigated the body after he was found. On his way out of Jelassi's jail cell, he's just trying to make a quick exit when the captain calls his attention. The captain would like to speak to him, and basically the captain is trying to get him to put in a good word for his son, who's trying to make it into the Inquisition. It is during this conversation that some irregularities when it comes to Lucan's paperwork and story start to surface, and so Lucan is found out and has to escape. The only way that he finds to escape is by dropping out of a 5th-story window into the sea below. Next, he decides to seek out Jelassi's housekeeper, who urges him that he can go to a certain party that is being held that evening, where he will be able to meet many of the players. He'll get to spot this merchant Murillo, and he will also be able to intercept the doctor who examined the body, Dr. Vasilis. Lucan attends the party, and after having extricated himself from a conversation with a drunken Korslakovan general called Ravin, he manages to make his way upstairs, where he encounters Dr. Vasilis. Dr. Vasilis seems quite upset when he mentions the frost on the body and tries to remove himself from the conversation. This behavior attracts the attention of a Lord Marchetta, who comes over to talk to Lucan to find out what he said that spooked the doctor so. Lucan pretends to be in Safrona in search for some silver, and it is with that in mind that Lord Marchetta introduces him to the merchant prince Murillo. They discuss some certain bills that are about to be put to power, so the particular bill that Lucan had previously discussed with Jelassi. However, Murillo seems quite competent in saying that this bill will never get voted through. On his way out of the party, he is approached by Dr. Vasilis, who asks him to meet him at the Collegium at midnight. Against the Scrivener's wishes, Lucan decides to investigate and to go there in spite of the Scrivener's instructions for him to not do anything without consulting with her first. He goes to the Collegium, where he finds the deceased body of Dr. Vasilis, whose throat has just been slashed. They examine the scene and Flea finds his journal hidden in the wall somewhere. And when Lucan investigates the journal, he finds out that the doctor did in fact notice the frost and that he came to the conclusion that the body of Lord Saviola was murdered with magic. However, the doctor was then threatened to keep him from revealing this information, and it is as Lucan is processing this information that he realizes that they were probably followed home. Lucan is currently hiding in a house that the Scrivener has made available to him, and the 2 guards that she has put to his disposal are killed by assassins, and Lucan and Flea then try to hide behind the fireplace upstairs. The group that were looking for them eventually give up the chase as they hear the city guard approaching. However, hours later, when Lucan and Flea decide to step out, Lucan realizes that one of them actually stayed behind, expecting that they would resurface sooner or later. A scuffle ensues between Lucan and this attacker, and in the process, Flea manages to shoot the attacker with a crossbow, but in the meantime, the house is also caught fire, so they have to escape the scene. They flee with their prisoner and hand the prisoner over to the Scrivener, who has her henchman Juro interrogate him. Juro then finds out that he's part of a rebel gang called the Seven Jewels that is led by Delfina, Delastro, and who is known as Diamond. The particular attacker that they have managed to catch is called Topaz. He admits that they were hired to roughen up the doctor, but that they were not involved in the actual murder of Lord Saviola himself. They also were ordered to steal a blade called the Sandino blade, a blade whose theft has been blamed on a infamous criminal known as Lady Midnight. Juro also managed to find out that they had a meeting scheduled with their employer for that evening at midnight, in which they would be guarding a tomb that their employer regularly has them guard while he conducts business inside. Lucan and Flea then go to this particular graveyard trying to look for the tomb, which they end up finding, but it is guarded by one of the members of the gang. He tries to overpower this gang member, but in the end he needs the help of Flea to knock this person unconscious. It is at that point that Lucan again goes against the wishes of the Scrivener by entering the tomb without backup. Lucan and Flea descend into the tomb and they follow the tracks that are left in the dust by the people who came before them. It is that way that they are able to overhear a conversation taking place between Diamond and her employer, who they believe to be Murillo, in which they are discussing a need for Lucan to be killed because he knows too much. However, it is also at that point in time that Lucan realizes that he recognizes this voice and that it is not the voice of Murillo, but actually the voice of Lord Marquetta. Marquetta and Diamond are at that point joined by the Prime Inquisitor Fierro and by the Pontifex Barbosa, who apparently have some scheme going on to try and kill the Zaragozan ambassador during the Grand Restoration celebration. Such an act would of course be a declaration of war against Zaragoza, and it turns out that basically they have been scheming together to bring this about, and that they've had the help of the housekeeper of Gelasi in trying to bring Gelasi down. However, as Marquetta no longer has a use for him, he kills the housekeeper. Fierro and Barbosa want to know how Marquetta plans to kill a major ambassador in front of the entire city without taking the blame, and it is at that point in time that a portal appears and 3 faceless step through. The faceless are creatures that are basically part of this sort of like ghost story that people tell to their kids. Nobody actually believes that they were true, and now 3 of them have just stepped through. The 3 that are there are the wolf, the viper and the kraken, and they seem to be answering to Lord Marquetta's demands. It is revealed that it was actually their power that was used to kill Lord Saviola, and that they are doing so in exchange for the Sandino blade that Marquetta had stolen. Now, it is unclear why they want this blade. However, in this particular moment, they notice the presence of Lucan, and the wolf sends a spectral wolf after Lucan in pursuit. Lucan and Flea sprint through the catacombs trying to make their way out. However, Lucan realizes that there is no way for them to get out without being caught by this wolf, so he decides that they should split up. Flea will be fleeing for her life, trying to reach the Scrivener and inform them of what they they've just overheard. Meanwhile, Lucan will try to get the attention of the wolf and get the wolf to pursue only him. It is in a moment in which he is about to get caught, he accidentally steps on some sort of a lever and a couple of bars fall down between him and the wolf. He thinks that he's now safe, however he's worried about Wolf maybe finding him some other way. However, as he turns around trying to look for another way out of the room, he's apprehended by some people who belong to the criminal element of the city, who are working under the twice-crowned king, which is the criminal overlord of Safrona. Thus, Lucan finds himself in a jail cell with the picture of a monster on the wall, and he discovers that this is basically a monster that is set to loom the underwater passages of the catacombs, and that the sort of like way in which the king shows his mercy is by setting his prisoners free to do what is referred to as the long dive, which is basically a dive through the catacombs, trying to find their way out, trying to find their way to freedom. If they're lucky, they just drown along the way. If unlucky, they meet a monster along the way. Lucan and a fellow prisoner are then brought before the twice-crowned king, which is a conjoined twin who go by the name of Snake and Scorpion. They seem to be pretty unhinged. They sentence the fellow prisoner to perform the Great Swim as he had stolen from them. And when Lucan steps up to tell his story, they don't really seem to believe his story at all. Lucan then informs them that he does know the actual identity of the thief of the Sandino blade, which does claim their attention. They decide to interrogate Lucan in a separate room where the entire court cannot overhear, but they are still not fully convinced of Lucan's story, and so they put him back in his jail cell. It is at this point in time that he is woken up in the middle of the night by a fellow prisoner being put into the same jail cell. He overhears the conversation between his new fellow inmate, who turns out to be Lady Midnight, and her jailer, who in his conversation kind of refers to the fact that he had the previous occupant of the cell moved. However, clearly the guards have managed to overlook that particular thing, because otherwise Lucan would no longer be in there. Lucan was pretty roughed up by the twice-crowned king's henchmen before he was thrown back into the jail cell. However, in exchange for telling Lady Midnight about the real identity of the thief of the Sandino blade, he manages to get her cooperation in trying to escape the jail cell. Lady Midnight then starts to vomit and vomits up a ring, which she says is what she can use to escape this jail cell. However, it is a Pharaon relic, and the relic has been used too recently, so they need to wait for it to recharge before they'll be able to use it again to escape this jail cell. Before the ring is fully recharged, they are accosted by the guards, who try to roughen them up. They enter into a scuffle with the guards. They manage to hold their own, and the ring recharges just in time for them to escape the scene together. However, going through the portal is a really triggering experience, and he once again faints. When he comes to, he finds himself in a room under threat of crossbow, with Lady Midnight and her henchman Alphonse in the room. They listen to his story, even though Alphonse is more in favor of just tying off loose ends and killing Lucan straight away. However, the Lady Midnight, who prefers to go by the name Ashra, believes Lucan's story and is willing to help him out and try and stop Lord Marquetta's plan from coming to fruition. They go to the Scrivener together, and along the way are reunited with Flea, who's very much starstruck when she meets her idol, Lady Midnight. The Scrivener listens to their story, but doesn't really seem to believe it, or in any case is unwilling to take any action. She informs Lucan that they are square, they are even, there's no need for him to perform any duties for her anymore, but she will also not help him out further. They then try to approach other authorities within the city, trying to warn them about what is to come. However, nobody takes their threats seriously, nobody wants to take any actions and help them out. As it is already the day of the Grand Restoration, there isn't really any plan that they can still come up with, so they end up making their way into an abandoned tower so that they can overlook the square and see the plan unfold before their eyes. There's already quite some tension going on between the Zargosas and the Safro Ronans as they arrive before the ceremony has even taken place, because of just some delays and some blockheads during the procession. On stage we see the elderly Duke who's slowly making his way along the steps, accompanied by his youthful and very popular wife and their two sons who very much resent this young wife for her position. And of course the Zaragozan ambassador is also there on stage. When she takes hold of the spear, there is some change that seems to take over her, and she turns towards the Duke and stabs the spear through the chin, and afterwards she stabs his two sons when they try to approach, even though they also seem to hesitate in their approach. It is only after she has murdered these three people that she seems to come to herself and realize what has just happened. Lucan walks away in despair and is kind of done with the whole thing now that he knows the full extent of Marqueta's plots. Marqueta wasn't just trying to start a war by assassinating the ambassador, he was staging a coup in order to take power from the Grand Duke, and he knew that Lord Saviola and Lady Jalassi would be like the biggest threats to him taking over power, so he got rid of them, got them out of the way before he took his plan to the next level. Asha finds Lucan and they have a squabble about him giving up and trying to continue on and hopefully still be able to sabotage Marqueta in some way or another. But their fight is interrupted by Diamond. Diamond has searched them out because she wants to barter for the release of her nephew Topaz, the scoundrel that they have interrogated earlier within the story. Lucan wants to strike a deal in which she will trade him the Sandino blade, however she no longer has the blade in her possession. What will be happening, however, is she and her crew will be escorting the blade to Marqueta's estate later that day. So what she offers is for him to be able to intercept the chest that contains the Sandino blade on its way. The chest is another Pharaon relic, so it is a chest that has a 4 color-coded lock for which only Marqueta knows the actual combination. However, it turns out that the Pontifex Barbosa actually saw Marqueta open the chest at one point, so he might also be aware of the exact combination that will open it. Ashra takes it upon herself to go and collect the code from Barbosa. She calls in a debt that somebody owes her in order for her to enter into the Pontifex's presence disguised as a hooker, and she is able to threaten him at knife point until he gives her the exact code. While Ashra is getting this code, Lucan is continuing with a newly forged plan. So he is now waiting in the streets for the carriage that will contain the Pharaon chest to arrive. He is a little bit worried because Ashra is late, however he hopes that she will make it in time for the arrival of the merchants. Unfortunately, when the merchants arrive with the chest, Ashra is not there yet, and as long as he doesn't have the code, he is unable to open the chest. The merchants therefore are threatening to just continue on with their journey and leave Lucan behind. However, he strikes a new deal with them in which he's offering them a whole lot of money in exchange for them to wait until Ashra arrives. The reason why the merchants were a little bit reluctant to stay is that after the assassination of the Grand Duke, a lot of riots have been happening because people are taking justice in their own hands and they are attacking the Zaragoza neighborhood, putting on fires everywhere, and of course in these situations there's always a lot of drunken guys who are also out just trying to cause havoc. And so one of these riots is actually just making its way to them as Lucan strikes this new deal, and so the merchant crew and Lucan have to fight off the rioters in order to protect the contents of the carriage. It is during this scuffle that Ashra finally shows up, saves Lucan's life, and is able to try and enter the code. However, as she's entering the color code on the Pharaon chest, it turns out that there's a little bit of a difficulty because Barbosa gave her the code and the final color that he gave her is the color green. However, there are 2 shades of green on the chest. So she has to kind of decide with the luck of the draw which color she's picking. She chooses the darker green, and luckily she chooses correctly. The Pharaon chest opens and they take possession of the Sandino blade. The merchants continue along their way to the Marchetta estate as if nothing had happened along the way. Meanwhile, Flea is hiding out further along the way in the city. She is waiting for the carriage to appear again, as she is going to be hiding aboard the carriage. So when the carriage passes beneath her, she jumps onto the carriage and she holds on for dear life and hopes that nobody has noticed her jumping on. It appears not to be the case. When the mercenary band arrives at Marchetta's estate, they are greeted by Inquisitor Fiero, who demands that they move the chest inside. However, they say that they are just getting out of town. They want nothing to do with it anymore, and they were not requested to do more than just hand over the chest, which is what they've done now. They leave the carriage behind and they ride off into the sunset. Piero orders a young boy to go and look for the palace guards in order for them to be able to move the chest inside. In the lull between that conversation, Flea jumps down from atop the carriage and makes her way inside, where she's going to have to start and look for the room in which the chest is being moved. However, she's struggling. She's trying to find her way inside. She's dealing with an annoying cat who is harassing her along the way and drawing far too much attention to the room that she's hiding in, but ultimately she manages to threaten a young boy, the same young boy who was looking for the guards, in order for him to tell her where she needs to be. Lucan and Ashra, in the meantime, are waiting outside, keeping an eye on the castle, trying to find out if Flea is ready for them or not, because they are going to use Ashra's ring to portal into the castle. Because the way in which these portal rings work is that there are two rings, and basically the one who initiates the transfer will be moved to the location of the second ring when they confirm. And so this is what they do, and then they are transformed. And then they are transported inside the domain, and the young boy helps them out further by pointing their way to a secret passageway that will lead to the room in which Marchetta is meeting the Faceless. They put the boy to sleep with some sort of a substance, and then they make their way inside, with Lucan informing Ashra that he wants her to flee with Flea, that he wants her to run away with Flea if things seem to be going south. Inside, Marchetta is holding the Lord Chancellor hostage, and he is joined by Prime Inquisitor Fiero and Pontifex Barbosa, who is looking a little bit anxious because he of course knows that he has given away the code to a stranger. The chest arrives, and so Marchetta decides that he will call upon the Faceless to make the exchange now. When the Faceless arrives, however, he reveals that he has no real reason to keep his fellow conspirators alive, and so they kill the Pontifex and the Prime Inquisitor. The Lord Chancellor, however, he leaves to himself. However, in the moment in which he is trying to kill the Lord Chancellor, the Faceless communicate with him. They don't really have a speech, but they communicate through images that they send to your brain, and so it is clear that they want him to exchange the blade at this point in time. It is as he is going to the chest to pick up the blade that Lucan also makes an appearance, as he knows that Marchetta is about to find out that the blade has been stolen. When Marchetta realizes that the blade is stolen and Lucan has stepped forward to claim victory, Marchetta orders the Faceless to kill Lucan. However, the Faceless do not respond, as he is no longer the one in command of the Sandino blade. So Lucan is now the one negotiating with the Faceless, and he asks the Faceless to create some sort of a proof of their dealings with Marchetta, some form of evidence that he can use to prove that Marchetta is the one responsible for the death of Lord Saviola, that Sandrusa is innocent, and that the entire conspiracy to kill the Grand Duke was actually orchestrated by Marchetta. Marchetta tries to attack him at that point in time, however the Faceless do restrain him, and they create a sort of orb that Lucan can use, and that recreates the images of the conversations between Markéta and the Faceless. He, at that point in time, hands over the Sandino blade, but before the Faceless leave, he cannot help but ask a few questions. Because Ashra and Lucan had been kind of speculating earlier about the reason why the Faceless want the Sandino blade. And the only thing that they can think about is that all of the stories used to say that the Faceless are beings who arrive on flying ships and that they are trading for some sort of a purple gem, and the Sandino blade actually has a purple gem in its handle. However, nobody really knows why they would want these purple gems, nor is it clear to them why they wouldn't just take these gems, why they are trading for them. So as he cannot help himself, he asks them about why they need these purple gems, and the Faceless surprise him by actually answering. So they show him the image of a Pharaon city with then an image of a giant purple crystal in a vaulted room with a lot of figures around it fighting, and one of the figures in that battle ultimately lunges towards the crystal with a spherical object in his hand, and the crystal shatters into a lot of pieces. And so it is clear that these purple gems that they are gathering are actually pieces of this shattered crystal. And as a consequence of the shattering of the crystal, the land had turned into a wasteland, a land that is referred to as the Grey Lands nowadays. Before they leave, he asks them another final question, because they were also contemplating the idea that perhaps the Faceless are actually just some pharaoh who have survived. However, the Faceless say no when he asks them whether they are actually pharaoh. At that point in time, the Faceless sever the connection that they were having with his mind, and they step through the portal and disappear. It is, of course, at that point in time when the guard finally steps up, breaks down the door and enters. Situation is, of course, a little bit hostile. However, the Lord Chancellor, of course, is there to corroborate the fact that Lucan and Ashra are not the ones who were responsible for him being tied up on the floor and for the death of the Pontifex and the Prime Inquisitor. Markéta at this point is subdued, he's unconscious, and he's handed over to the authorities. Lucan goes through many rounds of interrogation by the Inquisitors. However, they end up believing his side of the story due to the evidence he's able to portray, and due to the fact that the Pontifex ultimately turned out to have survived his assassination, and he admits to his crimes. So when Lucan is finally free to go where he wants to, he seeks out Sandrusa, who tells him that they are still trying to figure out what they will do with Markéta, but most likely he will end up in the bone pit facing the same monster she did, and that they are trying with all of their powers to kind of pacify things with the Zargostans, and to make sure that no war or conflict ensues from Markéta's schemes. She then hands over the pharaoh chest that his father had left in her possession, and inside the chest, a chest which opens when he presses his thumbprint to the panel, inside the chest he finds a key that Sandrusa recognizes as belonging to a bank, the Blackfire Bank in Korslakov. So we have our destination for our next adventure. Lucan says goodbye to Sandrusa, and he meets up with Ashra and Flea at a later point, telling them all about what has just happened and what he's planning to do now, and they clearly see that Lucan's father was much more than he ever thought that he was, because he always assumed that his father was just some boring scholar who was gathering artifacts at home, but it seems like he was quite the adventurer on his own accord. Sandrusa has arranged a ship for him, and when his ship arrives at it turns out to be, captained by the same captain who he got to sail him into Safrona at the beginning of the book. He is willing to go the distance alone, however, Flea and Ashra are ready to join him on this next adventure. So, let's move into book 2. So yeah, that was the recap of everything that happened in book 1, and now I just want to talk a little bit about like my thoughts about some of the things in this book and where we might go with the next one. Mainly I want to talk about the Pharaon, because I think the Pharaon and the Faceless, I guess, is very interesting, because when we look at these relics look very modern to me. The fact that you have like first of all we had that pyramids with the different sort of like buttons, and then like it would make these illusions and create this pain, and that is sort of like super fantastical, of course, so that just felt like, oh yeah, ancient civilization with weird magics. However, when we then get like the chest that opens with a color lock, and then later on we get this chest where he just has to put his thumbprint on there and it opens up, it feels very modern. And it can of course be modern inspired, but it could also just be that this Pharaon civilization was actually just like a super modern civilization, and that we've kind of regressed to in terms of technology afterwards. Or it could be even like some time play where actually the Pharaon are still to come, and like all these relics are actually just like roadmaps to the future, or like a sort of like spiraling time concept, who knows. But it all feels so modern that I'm just like, that it just confuses me in terms of, like a modern civilization that is so far in the past that nothing is really known about them anymore. And the same with the Faceless, because it has this sort of like throwaway line about how they arrived on these ships that's like sailed in the sky, and that people think that those are like fantastical ideas and that couldn't be possible. But that is also like a more sort of like sci-fi modern concept, the idea of them being aliens from sort of a spaceship and things like that. So I think we have some sort of like scientific sci-fi elements into this fantasy story that I wouldn't mind that being indeed the direction we go in with the Faces and the Pharaon, us discovering that they have sort of more like technology rather than just the magic that we see them perform as well. And the scuffle that we saw in the chamber that hosts the big purple crystal, like there's no confirmation of the fact whether this was a scuffle between the Faceless and the Pharaon or not, but perhaps this was so. And it seems clear that the Pharaon are trading for more of the shattered remains of that crystal, assumingly to reproduce the crystal, to reforge this giant crystal, and thus like rebuild their society, or the Pharaon society. This is unclear to me, and I think that probably I am speculating that potentially this is going to be like the big conflict is going to be that keeping that from happening, because basically in this book they have been somewhat neutral. They were the enemy in the sense of they're like a super overpowering force that they know nothing about, that scare them witless with power beyond their imaginings, but ultimately they're not really violent. They're violent because of the violence of the men who are commanding them, but ultimately they turn around and they also are the ones who are helping us in the end. But I would think that it would be a fun twist if, like we have them helping us potentially as well in the second book, but that ultimately, grand scheme of things, it actually turns out that the more of these purple gems that they get, the more that puts our society at risk. Just my speculation. My idea is that the Faceless probably kind of destroyed the Pharaon, that they're responsible for the cataclysm that destroyed the Pharaon society. Potentially even this whole shattering of the purple crystal, maybe it's something that they thought that they needed to do in order to destroy the Pharaon, but then it also destroyed them and they weren't expecting it. Wild speculation here that's coming off of so little that it can be very much wrong, but I'm still like, those are still some thoughts about like the direction it could take in for me. But definitely we're gonna see more Pharaon relics, and I'm expecting us to see more of the faces as well in the second book, because it would be wild to me if we don't do more with that. And I'm actually a little bit surprised that we, for example, didn't do more with the Gleamers, so I'm also kind of expecting for the Gleamers to potentially make an appearance later on again in the series, even though we're going to another part of the world. And the only real explanation that we get for that part of the world is it's something about like men who look like wolves and wolves who act like beasts or something like that. So a very different vibe to that part of the world than the part of the world that we have just been visiting. But yeah, I'm expecting more Pharaon relics. I'm definitely expecting us to meet with the Faceless again and potentially see them covered another purple gem. The cover for the Blackfire Blade is super purple. It can be very much coincidence just because of the vibe that they were potentially going with a little bit more of a an icy, colder temperature versus the warmer temperature of the Silverblood Promise and Safrona. But then they could have gone blue, you know. They've chosen to go purple, and I'm choosing to think that that means something. But yeah, that is my expectation, and I also expect to see certain characters back, because it seems to me like it is impossible for us to have had that scene with that Koslakoven general at the party and to get a name for him if it weren't for the fact that we're meeting this guy again. So, you know, in case you don't remember, as I mentioned it in my recap for this reason only, but at some point he goes to this party to find this Dr. Vasilis, and at that point in time he is kind of waylaid by a drunk general from Korslakov called Ravin, and they have what seems to be an insignificant conversation with one another. And the only reason why that conversation would take place in my mind is for this character to make an appearance again in the next book. And the same goes for the Lady in Red, which I also mentioned in my recap. So when he has this contest in which he has to like push the buttons of the pyramids, one of his opponents is referred to as the Lady in Red, and we don't really find out more about her. And granted, there are two other opponents in that game who are mentioned, but somehow I got the vibes when we were in that scene that this Lady in Red was important and that we were going to meet her again. But yeah, I think there are definitely a few elements in this book that I kind of took note of, and I was like, ooh, that's gonna come back, and then that didn't come back. So that kind of makes me wonder whether we're true with Safrona, whether we're never gonna come back, or whether we might at some point come back to the events and the new power dynamics in Safrona, and whether these things might still tie in at some point or not, whether this was just like world building, enriching the story, and like bringing more life and realism to this place. But yeah, those are my main thoughts about this ending. So in terms of what's gonna happen in the next book, I mean, there's gonna be another plot that he's gonna be embroiled with, I'm sure. And I'm assuming that there's gonna be some sort of a fallout at some point as well within our core group of the of Lucan, Ashra and Flea, because I think dynamically speaking there should also be something within this crew, some drama at some point, right? But aside from that, those are my speculations. Let me know if there is anything that you want to point out about what happens in this book, or in terms of your ideas about what might be next in the next book or even further, and your thoughts about the Pharaon and the Faceless. Are these good guys, bad guys? Is one of them good or neither? Let me know. But so yeah, hope you guys enjoyed this video. Hope you guys are looking forward to the Blackfire Blade. I will definitely be reading it the moment it arrives, because the Silverblood Promise was my favorite book of 2024. So hope you guys enjoyed this video, and see you guys for the next one. Bye!